The war had been over for 8 months, but for some people, peace was still starving them. The wind moved through the freight yard with a low metallic whistle, slipping between rows of rust-stained cargo containers and abandoned supply crates. Thin sheets of frost clung to every exposed surface, turning the sprawling refugee district into a landscape of dull silver and pale gray. Ethan Walker pulled his jacket tighter around his shoulders as he joined the line outside Distribution Center 12. The line stretched nearly 200 feet across the cracked concrete lot. Men, women, children, humans and aliens alike. Everyone waited in silence. Nobody wasted energy talking anymore. Above them, a flickering holographic sign repeated the same message every 30 seconds. Limited rations. One allocation per citizen. Thank you for your patience. Ethan glanced toward the dark clouds gathering beyond the distant skyline. Snow was coming again. The third storm this week. He rubbed his hands together, trying to force warmth back into his fingers. The old injury in his left wrist always ached when temperatures dropped below freezing. Around him, people shifted their weight and stared forward with tired eyes. Nobody complained. Nobody argued. Hunger had a way of making people quiet. Nearly 40 minutes later, Ethan finally reached the front counter. A weary worker slid a paper bag across the metal surface. Last shipment until next week, she said without looking up. Try to make it last. Ethan nodded. Thanks. He stepped away and looked inside. One bread roll, slightly stale, small enough to fit in his palm, along with a plastic bottle containing maybe 12 ounces of purified water. That was it. His entire weekly ration. He let out a slow breath. It wasn't much, but it was more than some people received. Pulling the bag close to his chest, he started the long walk back toward the worker housing blocks near the edge of the district. The cold bit through his boots with every step. Somewhere overhead, a transport shuttle growled through the clouds before disappearing into the overcast sky. The war had ended. Officially, anyway. Politicians loved saying that. They smiled during speeches, signed agreements, shook hands for cameras. But Ethan had spent enough years working military logistics to understand the truth. Wars didn't really end when the shooting stopped. They ended years later, sometimes decades later. They ended when children stopped going hungry. They ended when families stopped sleeping in shelters. They ended when nobody needed ration lines anymore. A sudden movement caught his eye. About 50 yards ahead, near a collapsed transit terminal, someone stumbled. Ethan slowed. At first he thought it was just another exhausted refugee. Then he saw her fall. The figure hit the frozen pavement hard and didn't get back up. People kept walking. Some glanced over briefly. Most didn't even look. Ethan stopped. The wind carried loose snow across the ground between them. For several seconds, nobody moved toward her. Nobody offered help. Nobody spoke. It was as if she had become invisible the moment she collapsed. Ethan felt something tighten in his chest. He looked down at the paper bag in his hand, then back at the motionless figure. The distance between them couldn't have been more than a few car lengths, yet somehow it felt much farther. He adjusted his grip on the ration bag and started walking toward her. As he got closer, details emerged through the drifting snow. She was young, alien. Her skin carried a faint blue-silver hue beneath the frost covering her cheeks. Long pale hair spilled across the pavement like strands of frozen moonlight. Her clothing hung loose from her thin frame, several sizes too large, patched together from mismatched relief supplies. She looked frighteningly light, as though a strong gust might carry her away. Ethan crouched beside her. Her eyes were closed, her breathing shallow, slow, barely visible in the cold air. Then, almost imperceptibly, her eyelids fluttered. Golden eyes opened halfway. Confused, distant, exhausted. She looked at him as if she wasn't entirely certain he was real. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The wind howled through the broken transit station behind them. Snowflakes drifted between their faces. Then her gaze dropped to the paper bag in Ethan's hand. And something in her eyes changed. Not hope. Not yet. Just hunger. Pure, overwhelming hunger. The girl's gaze remained fixed on the paper bag, as though it contained something impossible. Ethan had seen that look before. He had seen it in shelters during the final months of the war. He had seen it in children waiting outside field kitchens. Hunger changed people. It stripped away pride first, then certainty, then everything else. He carefully set the bag on the frozen pavement beside her and unscrewed the cap from the water bottle. The plastic crackled in the cold. Easy, he said quietly. Do not try to sit up too fast. Her golden eyes shifted toward his face. Suspicion lingered there beneath the exhaustion. She looked past him at the busy street, almost expecting someone to stop him. Nobody did. Refugees shuffled through the snow. Freight haulers pushed overloaded carts. A maintenance drone hummed overhead. The city continued without noticing either of them. Ethan held out the bottle. For several seconds, she simply stared at it. Then her trembling hand slowly reached forward. Her fingers were ice cold against the plastic. She took one careful sip, then another. The tension in her shoulders eased slightly. Thank you, she whispered. Her voice sounded rough, as if she had not spoken much recently. Ethan gave a small nod. What is your name? She hesitated before answering. Lyra. The name was soft, almost swallowed by the wind. Ethan opened the paper bag. The smell of bread drifted into the cold air. Not fresh, not warm. Just simple ration bread baked days ago and distributed by people who had long since run out of better options. Yet the moment the scent reached her, Lyra closed her eyes. Ethan noticed her throat move. She looked embarrassed by her own reaction. Take it, he said. Her eyes opened immediately. No, Ethan blinked. No. She looked at the bread and then back at him. It belongs to you. Not anymore. You need it too. Ethan let out a breath that turned white in the freezing air. Probably. Lyra lowered her gaze. Then why? The question lingered between them. Ethan found himself searching for an answer. Not because he did not have one. Because. The answer seemed too simple. Because you look like you need it more. For a moment, she simply stared at him. Then she looked away quickly, as though the response had unsettled her. Ethan broke the bread in half. He placed one piece into her hands. The other remained in his own. Lyra's eyes widened. You are sharing it. Seems fair. You barely know me. Ethan shrugged. That has never stopped people from helping each other before. The faintest expression crossed her face. Not quite a smile. More like someone remembering what a smile felt like. Slowly, carefully, she lifted the bread toward her lips. She took a small bite. Then another. Ethan pretended not to notice the tears gathering in the corners of her eyes. Around them, the first snowflakes of the storm began drifting from the darkening sky. The city lights flickered on one by one beyond the freight yard. Orange, white, blue, small islands of light against the approaching night. Lyra ate slowly, almost reverently, as though every bite carried a memory she was afraid to lose. Ethan sat beside her on the frozen pavement without speaking. Neither of them noticed the cold as much anymore. For the first time that day, Lyra no longer looked like someone waiting to disappear. The snow was falling harder now, covering the freight yard in a thin white layer that softened the sharp edges of the world. Ethan and Lyra remained beneath the cracked shelter of the old transit terminal while evening settled over the district. Somewhere in the distance, a warning horn echoed across the industrial zone as another cargo convoy arrived from orbit. The sound faded into the wind. Lyra finished the last small piece of bread and carefully brushed the crumbs from her hands. Ethan noticed that she did not waste a single one. Even the smallest fragments disappeared into her palm before she ate them. For several moments, neither of them spoke. The silence felt strangely comfortable. Then Lyra looked toward the glowing city skyline beyond the refugee sector. Towers of glass and steel shimmered through the snowfall like distant stars. I used to work there, she said quietly. Ethan followed her gaze. In the city? She nodded. Before everything changed. Ethan leaned back against a concrete support column. The structure groaned softly as the wind pushed against it. What did you do? Lyra hesitated. Translation work. Ethan raised an eyebrow. Languages. Languages. Negotiations. Diplomatic records. Her voice carried the careful tone of someone choosing each word with caution. I worked between governments during the war. Ethan studied her for a moment. Nothing about her appearance suggested an important official. Her oversized coat was worn thin. Her boots looked borrowed. Yet there was something in the way she spoke. Something precise. Educated. Controlled. That sounds important, he said. A faint smile appeared and disappeared just as quickly. Not important enough. The answer hung in the cold air. Ethan did not push further. Years of military logistics had taught him that everyone carried stories they were not ready to tell. Above them, a maintenance drone drifted past with blinking navigation lights. Its spotlight briefly swept across the transit terminal before moving on. Lyra watched it disappear. Most people stopped asking questions months ago, she said. Questions about who I was, where I came from, why I ended up here. Ethan looked down at the empty paper bag resting beside his boot. Maybe they were afraid of the answers. And you? He considered that. I think people become invisible when everyone is struggling. Lyra stared at him. Invisible. It happens. Ethan gestured toward the refugee district. There are thousands of people here. Everyone is carrying their own problems. After a while, they stopped seeing anything else. The wind shifted direction, carrying the smell of machinery, diesel heaters, and distant cooking fires through the terminal. Lyra wrapped her arms around herself. I spent 3 weeks trying to find work, she admitted. Nobody wanted translators anymore. The war ended. The contracts disappeared. Ethan frowned. 3 weeks. 3 weeks. And no one hired you. She shook her head. No one even read my applications. Ethan looked away toward the falling snow. Something about that bothered him more than he expected. The war had taken enough from people already. The least peace could have done was give them a chance to rebuild. A sudden gust rattled the broken glass overhead. Lyra flinched slightly. Ethan noticed immediately. She was exhausted. The kind of exhaustion that sleep alone could not fix. He stood and pulled his jacket tighter. Come on. Lyra looked up. Where? Worker housing block 19. She blinked. Why? Ethan offered a small shrug. Because it is going to be 10 degrees tonight, and sitting under a broken roof seems like a terrible plan. For the first time since he had met her, genuine surprise appeared on her face. She stared at him as if she could not quite understand what she was hearing. Then slowly, almost reluctantly, she stood to her feet. And together they stepped out into the falling snow. The walk to housing block 19 took nearly 20 minutes through the storm. Snow gathered along the edges of the cracked service roads and swirled around abandoned loading equipment that had not moved in months. Overhead, floodlights cast pale circles across the drifting white haze, making the refugee district look like a forgotten outpost at the edge of the world. Ethan kept a steady pace while Lyra followed beside him. She spoke very little. Every few minutes he noticed her glancing around as though she expected someone to stop them. Nobody did. Most people were already hurrying indoors before the weather became worse. When the housing block finally appeared through the snow, it looked less like an apartment building and more like a stack of old cargo containers welded together. Warm yellow light glowed behind a handful of windows. A ventilation unit rattled somewhere above them. Ethan climbed the narrow metal stairs and unlocked a dented gray door. Warm air immediately drifted into the hallway. It smelled faintly of coffee, machine oil, and old books. Lyra froze in the doorway. Ethan noticed. It is not much, he said, but it is warm. Slowly she stepped inside. The apartment consisted of a small living area, a compact kitchen, and a sleeping alcove separated by a curtain. A portable heater hummed quietly near the wall. Shelves built from recycled shipping crates held stacks of manuals, engineering guides, and maintenance reports. A single lamp illuminated the room with a soft amber glow. Compared to the city towers beyond the refugee district, the place was tiny. Compared to sleeping beneath a broken transit station, it felt like luxury. Lyra stood near the entrance, uncertain whether she was truly allowed to stay. Ethan hung his jacket beside the door and moved toward the kitchen counter. Sit down, he said. You look like you might fall over again. For a moment, she almost argued. Then exhaustion won. She lowered herself into a chair at the small table. Ethan filled an electric kettle and switched it on. The familiar sound of heating water filled the apartment. Tea, he asked. Lyra blinked. You still have tea? A few bags left. Those are valuable. Ethan smiled faintly. Only if you never drink them. The response seemed to catch her off guard. While the water heated, Ethan opened a cabinet and pulled out 2 ceramic mugs. One had a chipped handle. The other carried the faded logo of a shipping company that no longer existed. Small reminders of a world that had changed too quickly. When he placed the mug in front of Lyra, she stared at it for several seconds. Nobody has invited me into their home since the war ended, she said quietly. Ethan paused. Something about the sentence made the room feel smaller. That long. She nodded. The kettle clicked off. Steam rose into the warm air. Ethan prepared the tea and slid the mug toward her. She wrapped both hands around it immediately, absorbing the heat. Her shoulders relaxed for the first time all evening. Outside, wind rattled against the windows. Inside, the apartment remained still. Safe. Lyra looked down into the rising steam. "Why are you doing this?" she asked softly. Ethan leaned back in his chair. The answer came without effort. "Because if the world gets cold enough, somebody has to keep a light on." For several seconds Lyra said nothing. Then she lowered her gaze, and Ethan noticed her eyes beginning to shine again. This time she did not try to hide it. The storm continued through the night. Snow tapped softly against the apartment windows while the heater filled the room with a steady mechanical hum. For the first time in months, Lyra found herself sitting somewhere that felt safe enough to close her eyes. The tea had long since cooled, but she still held the mug between her hands as if it were something precious. Ethan busied himself in the small kitchen, organizing supplies and checking the charge levels on a portable power unit. He deliberately avoided staring at her. People carried enough burdens without feeling examined. Eventually Lyra spoke. "You live alone?" Ethan nodded. "For the past 3 years. Family." He paused for a moment. "Back on Earth." Lyra looked up. "You do not visit?" A faint smile appeared on his face. "Travel between systems costs more money than I have." She lowered her gaze. Somehow that answer felt familiar. The war had stranded countless people far from home. Some physically, others emotionally. The heater clicked as it adjusted its temperature. Ethan finally sat across from her at the small table. Between them rested the empty mugs and the quiet comfort of shared silence. Lyra glanced around the apartment again. The shelves caught her attention. Manuals, engineering references, maintenance guides. Every available space seemed occupied by books or datapads. "You read all of those?" she asked. "Most of them." "Why?" Ethan shrugged. "Because machines make sense." The answer earned the faintest laugh from her. It was small, fragile, yet it transformed her face completely. For the first time, Ethan could imagine what she had looked like before hardship hollowed out her expression. "Machines make sense," she repeated. "Usually. And people are complicated." Another brief smile touched her lips. Then it faded. Her eyes drifted toward the dark window. Beyond the glass, snow continued falling beneath the distant city lights. "I used to believe people made sense too," she said quietly. Ethan said nothing. He sensed the memory approaching before the words arrived. When the negotiations started, everyone spoke about peace, cooperation, rebuilding. Her fingers tightened slightly around the ceramic mug. "For a while, I believed them." Ethan listened. "Then the war ended," she continued. "The speeches ended. The cameras left. Funding disappeared. Refugees became statistics." The room fell silent again. Somewhere in the building, old pipes rattled behind the walls. Ethan studied the worn tabletop between them. "You sound disappointed." Lyra released a soft breath. "I am disappointed." Then she looked directly at him. "That is why today made no sense." Ethan blinked. "What part?" "You." He frowned slightly. Lyra continued before he could respond. "You had almost nothing, yet you shared it." Her golden eyes remained fixed on his. "Most people protect what little they have left." Ethan thought about the bread, the tea, the apartment. None of it had felt extraordinary. "Maybe," he said slowly, "but I think people need each other more when times are hard." Lyra stared at him as though she had never considered the possibility. The silence that followed felt different from before. Less heavy, less lonely. Then Ethan noticed something sticking out of the pocket of her oversized coat. A small notebook. Worn. Weathered. Its edges bent from use. Lyra immediately tucked it deeper into the fabric when she saw him glance toward it. The movement was subtle but unmistakable. Ethan pretended not to notice. Yet curiosity lingered in the back of his mind. Whatever was inside that notebook mattered. A great deal. Outside, the storm showed no signs of stopping. Inside, for the first time in a very long while, Lyra felt warm. And somewhere beneath the layers of exhaustion, grief, and disappointment, a tiny spark of hope began to glow once more. Morning arrived beneath a sky the color of steel. The storm had finally passed, leaving the refugee district buried beneath fresh snow that reflected the pale light of dawn. Ethan woke early, as he always did. Years of shift work had trained his body to rise before sunrise. The apartment remained quiet except for the soft hum of the heater and the occasional creak of the building settling against the cold. He moved carefully through the kitchen, preparing a simple breakfast from the few supplies he had left. When the smell of heated grain filled the room, he noticed movement near the sleeping alcove. Lyra stepped into the living area wrapped in a spare blanket. For the first time, She looked rested. Not fully recovered. Not yet. But different. The deep exhaustion that had shadowed her face seemed less severe. "Good morning," Ethan said. Lyra blinked as if she had forgotten what it felt like to wake up indoors. "Good morning." They shared breakfast at the small table, while sunlight slowly filtered through the frosted window. Outside, workers were already clearing pathways between the housing blocks. Snow removal drones drifted overhead with mechanical precision. Life continued. As they ate, Ethan noticed the notebook again resting beside Lyra's chair. This time she did not hide it. Instead, her fingers lingered on its worn cover. "You keep looking at it," she said quietly. Ethan smiled apologetically. Occupational hazard. Engineering. Curiosity. For several seconds, she studied him. Then she released a slow breath and opened the notebook. The pages were crowded with names. Hundreds of them. Some written in human languages. Others in alien scripts Ethan did not recognize. Every page carried more names. More dates. More locations. The notebook looked less like a journal and more like a record. Ethan frowned. "Who are they?" Lyra ran her fingertips gently across the paper. "People. Family." She shook her head. "Survivors." Ethan looked closer. Entire pages had been carefully organized. Names. Refugee transport numbers. Settlement records. Emergency housing assignments. Some entries contained notes written in different colors of ink. Others had small stars drawn beside them. "I do not understand," Ethan admitted. Lyra stared down at the notebook for a long moment before answering. "During the war, I coordinated civilian evacuation routes." Ethan remained silent. "Entire colonies were displaced," she continued. "Families separated. Records destroyed. Communication systems collapsed." Her voice remained calm, but he could hear the weight beneath it. Someone had to keep track of where people went. Ethan slowly turned another page. More names. More records. More lives preserved in fading ink. "You did all this yourself?" She nodded. "Whenever I could." "Why keep doing it?" Now, for the first time that morning, emotion appeared openly in her eyes. "Because people are still looking for each other." The answer settled heavily between them. Ethan looked back down at the notebook. Suddenly he understood why she guarded it so carefully. This was not a list. It was a promise. Every name represented someone who had survived. Someone who mattered. Someone who might still be searching for home. "How many?" he asked softly. Lyra's gaze moved across the pages. "Last count." She paused. "Nearly 4,000. Ethan stared at her. 4,000 lives. 4,000 stories. 4,000 people who might never know the woman sitting across from him had spent years making sure they were not forgotten. Outside, the city continued its ordinary morning. Inside the small apartment, Ethan felt something shift. The hungry refugee he had met beside the transit terminal was not who the world believed she was. And somehow, he suspected this was only the beginning of the truth. 3 days passed before Ethan realized how many people knew Lyra's name. It started with a knock on his apartment door just after sunset. Outside stood an elderly alien woman wrapped in a weathered gray coat. Snow clung to her boots. Her eyes immediately widened when she saw Lyra sitting at the kitchen table. For a moment, neither woman spoke. Then the visitor pressed a trembling hand against her mouth. "You are alive," she whispered. Lyra rose from her chair so quickly it nearly tipped backward. "Mara." The older woman nodded. Tears appeared instantly. Ethan stepped aside as the two embraced. He quietly moved into the kitchen, giving them privacy. Their conversation lasted nearly an hour. Names. Memories. Families reunited after evacuation. Settlements rebuilt. Lives restored. When Mara finally left, she carried a smile Ethan suspected had been absent for years. After the door closed, Lyra remained standing in silence. "Friend?" Ethan asked. Lyra shook her head. "No, family." Again she shook her head. "One of the people from the notebook." Ethan stared. "You helped her?" Lyra looked down. "Her grandchildren." The answer lingered in the room. Ethan was beginning to understand the scale of what she had done. The next visitor arrived the following afternoon. Then another the day after that. Some came with photographs. Others brought letters. A few simply wanted to confirm the rumors were true. The woman who had helped locate missing families during the chaos of war had been living forgotten among refugees. Word spread quietly through the district. Not through official channels. Through people. By the end of the week, Ethan noticed something unusual happening whenever he and Lyra walked through the settlement. Strangers greeted her. Some offered food. Others offered work. One elderly man removed his hat and thanked her before continuing down the street. Lyra accepted every gesture with visible discomfort. "You do not like attention," Ethan observed one evening as they returned from a supply market. Snow crunched beneath their boots. Warm light glowed from apartment windows across the housing complex. Lyra smiled weakly. Attention usually arrives attached to expectations. Ethan considered that. Fair point. They continued walking. Then Lyra spoke again. "I never expected anyone to remember." Ethan stopped. "For 1,000 names." She looked at him. "People move on. Not from something like that." Her gaze drifted toward the distant skyline. "Most governments did." Ethan frowned. "What do you mean?" Lyra hesitated. For the first time since revealing the notebook, genuine concern appeared in her expression. There were people who wanted the records destroyed. Ethan's footsteps slowed. "Destroyed?" She nodded. "Too many mistakes. Too many displaced civilians. Too many inconvenient questions." The cold wind swept across the walkway between housing blocks. Ethan felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. "And the notebook?" Lyra rested a hand against the pocket containing it. The notebook survived. They walked the remaining distance in thoughtful silence. Later that night, long after the district had gone quiet, Ethan awoke to the faint glow of light from the living room. He stepped from the sleeping alcove and found Lyra sitting alone at the table. The notebook lay open before her. She was adding another name. Then, another. The clock on the wall showed 2:17 a.m. "You should be sleeping," Ethan said softly. Lyra looked up. Her expression carried equal parts determination and sadness. "Someone out there is still searching." Ethan glanced at the endless pages. Thousands of names. Thousands of lives. Then he noticed something else. Tucked inside the back cover was an official seal. Faded. Nearly hidden. Yet unmistakably important. His eyes narrowed. Whatever truth Lyra had not revealed yet, it was far bigger than either of them had imagined. The following morning, Ethan could not stop thinking about the seal hidden inside the notebook. The image had only appeared for a second when the pages shifted beneath the lamp, yet it remained fixed in his memory. He had seen it before during the war. Not often. Only on diplomatic transports, classified communications, and official peace commission documents. It belonged to the Interstellar Reconciliation Authority, the organization that had negotiated the final ceasefire between dozens of worlds. As sunlight filtered through the apartment window, Ethan found Lyra standing beside the small kitchen counter preparing tea. The notebook rested nearby. This time she seemed less protective of it. "Can I ask you something?" Ethan said. Lyra looked up. "You usually do." The seal in the notebook. Her hands froze. Not dramatically, just enough for Ethan to notice. Silence filled the room. Outside, children were already playing in the snow between housing blocks. Their distant laughter drifted through the glass. Lyra slowly placed the tea packet down. "You recognized it?" "Yes." She looked out the window for several moments before speaking. "I wondered how long that would take." Ethan waited. Eventually, she walked to the table and carefully opened the notebook. Near the back, tucked between worn pages, rested a folded identification card. The edges had faded from years of handling. She slid it toward him. Ethan picked it up. His eyes moved across the text. Then he read it again. And again. The photograph showed a younger version of Lyra. Healthier. Confident. Standing beneath the emblem of the Peace Authority. Her title occupied 3 lines. Senior Civilian Coordination Director. Emergency Population Recovery Division. Ethan slowly lowered the card. "You were not just a translator." Lyra offered a tired smile. "No, you ran refugee operations. Across 7 systems." Ethan stared at her. Suddenly, every piece of the puzzle began fitting together. The records. The names. The visitors. The thousands of families who seemed to know her. "You helped organize the civilian evacuations." Lyra nodded. Millions of people were displaced. Entire colonies disappeared from communication networks. "We built tracking systems from whatever survived." Ethan sat down heavily. "And nobody knows?" A shadow crossed her expression. "Some people know." "Then why are you here?" The question escaped before he could stop it. Lyra folded her hands together. "Because peace requires heroes while it is being built." Her voice remained calm. "Afterward, heroes become reminders." Ethan frowned. Reminders of what? Of mistakes. Delays. Political failures. Broken promises. The apartment grew quiet. Ethan understood far more than he wished he did. Governments loved success stories. They rarely celebrated the people who revealed uncomfortable truths. Lyra looked toward the notebook. The records proved how many civilians were overlooked after the war. Some officials wanted those numbers forgotten. Ethan felt his chest tighten. But you kept them. Someone had to. Another silence settled between them. Then a soft knock sounded at the door. Ethan rose and opened it. Standing outside were three strangers bundled against the cold. A human woman, an elderly alien man, and a teenage boy. The moment they saw Lyra, their faces changed. Relief, recognition, gratitude. The woman stepped forward first. Tears filled her eyes. "We finally found her," she whispered. Lyra immediately stood. Confusion crossed her face. The elderly man held out an old photograph. In the image stood a younger version of himself beside two small children. On the back was a transport registration number, one of the numbers from the notebook. "You reunited our family," he said softly. 9 years ago. Nobody spoke after that. They did not need to. Ethan watched as the visitors surrounded Lyra, thanking her for something she had never spoken about herself. And as he stood there, he finally understood the truth. The woman who had nearly collapsed from hunger beside a frozen transit station had quietly changed thousands of lives. Yet somehow, the world had forgotten her. The story spread farther than anyone expected, not through official broadcasts or government announcements, but through conversations. A grateful grandmother telling her neighbors. A reunited family sharing an old transport record. A former refugee recognizing a name from a notebook. Within weeks, people began arriving from every corner of the settlement district. Some carried photographs. Others carried letters preserved for years. A few simply wanted to shake Lyra's hand and say thank you. She accepted each visitor with the same quiet humility that had first puzzled Ethan. She never spoke about her accomplishments. Never corrected anyone who underestimated her. Never demanded recognition. One cold evening, nearly a month after Ethan had found her beside the transit terminal, an official transport descended into the district. Its polished silver hull stood out sharply against the weathered refugee housing. Curious residents gathered along the walkways as several representatives stepped onto the snow-covered pavement. They carried government credentials and sealed documents. Ethan watched from his apartment window while Lyra stood silently beside him. "Did you know they were coming?" he asked. She shook her head. No, the officials approached respectfully. Their leader, an elderly woman with silver hair and formal attire, removed a tablet from her case. "Lyra Voss," she said. "After a full review of archived records, the Interstellar Reconciliation Authority formally recognizes your service during the civilian recovery operations." The crowd fell silent. Snow drifted gently through the evening air. "Your work directly contributed to the recovery, relocation, and reunification of more than 4 million displaced civilians across 7 systems." Ethan glanced toward Lyra. She looked almost uncomfortable hearing the numbers spoken aloud. The official continued. "History should have remembered your name long ago." A small presentation followed. Certificates, medals, public acknowledgments. Cameras recorded everything. Yet throughout the ceremony, Ethan noticed something strange. Lyra never looked at the awards. Her attention remained elsewhere. Later that evening, after the officials departed and the crowd slowly dispersed, Ethan found her sitting alone at the small kitchen table. The apartment looked exactly as it had the day she arrived. The heater hummed softly. Snow tapped against the windows. The notebook rested beside her hands. On the table sat the newly awarded medal. Untouched, Ethan poured 2 cups of tea and sat across from her. "You should be happy," he said gently. Lyra smiled. "I am." "Then why do you look sad?" She stared into the rising steam for several seconds. "Because today reminded me of everyone who never came home." Ethan nodded. That answer sounded exactly like her. After a moment, she opened the notebook and turned to the very first page. Ethan noticed something he had never seen before. Tucked inside the cover was a small piece of folded paper. Old, worn, carefully preserved. "What is that?" he asked. Lyra unfolded it slowly. Inside was a simple food ration voucher from the refugee district. Worth almost nothing. Expired weeks ago. Ethan frowned in confusion. Then he recognized it. It was the voucher from the day they met. The one he had exchanged for his weekly bread ration. "You kept that?" he asked quietly. Lyra looked up at him. Her golden eyes reflected the warm kitchen light. The governments gave me medals, she said softly. The refugees gave me their gratitude. Her fingers rested gently on the faded voucher. But this was the day someone reminded me that kindness still existed. Ethan did not know what to say. Outside, snow continued falling beneath the distant city lights. Inside, silence settled comfortably around them. The medal remained untouched on the table. The notebook remained open. And beside thousands of names that had changed history, a simple paper voucher rested like a treasure. Years later, many people would remember the woman who helped reunite millions. They would study her records, celebrate her achievements, and teach her story. But Lyra never forgot something much smaller. Not the ceremony, not the recognition, not the applause. She remembered a freezing afternoon beside a broken transit station when a man with almost nothing chose to share what little he had. The war had ended because of treaties and negotiations, but her faith in people returned because of a single act of kindness. And sometimes, that was the greater miracle.